Hello and welcome to European SharePoint Training Week, a week of live webinars, ebooks and blogs from the top SharePoint experts in the industry. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Swider, who will be talking to you about data visualization with SharePoint and SQL Server. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC14. Paul is one of an impressive list of speakers for the European SharePoint Conference, which will take place in Barcelona, May 5 to 8, 2014. Go to www.sharepointeurope.com for more information on the 100 plus sessions that will take place. All the speakers from European SharePoint Training Week will be there, along with the likes of Dan Holm, Jeremy Take, Michael Noel and Joel Olsen. After the webinar we will have questions. Type any questions you have for Paul in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Paul Swider. Hello, Paul.
Hello, thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about data visualization and SharePoint and SQL Server. So this is a topic that I've been passionate about for some time, and it's always a pleasure to speak to folks about this. So a little bit about me. Again, my name is Paul Swider. I've been a Microsoft consultant and software entrepreneur and writer and speaker and author for close to 20 years now. A couple of the projects that I've worked on recently include the SharePoint development books from ROX. So I was involved with the 2010 version of that book and for multiple editions, and the 2013 development book, as well as being a technical editor for ROX as well. And so you can see on my opening screen here I have a bunch of pictures of a couple of the places that I've been. One of the things I'm fortunate enough to do is to be able to travel and meet the SharePoint community and talk to them about SharePoint technology and development and business intelligence. And I consider myself very lucky to be able to do that. And sometimes on mornings like this, it's actually nice to be able to sit in the office and be able to reach out to people around the world as well without getting on an airplane. So this is a pleasure as well. So our agenda today, we're going to be talking about data visualization in SharePoint. And so what I'd like to do first is just sort of define what I mean by data visualization and make a distinction between data visualization and traditional business intelligence. And then what I'm going to do is start to talk about some of the visualization tools that are available in SQL Server. And so those include things like reporting services and SQL Server integration services. And we'll explore some tips and techniques and methodologies for combining traditional business intelligence efforts, if you will, and then marrying them up with things from SharePoint like PerformancePoint Services and PowerView and PowerPivot and some of the other features in the Business Insights template. And we'll have a quick chat about business connectivity services as well. So the idea here is that, again, what we want to do is just understand that there's in my mind anyway, when I'm talking about data visualization, there's a distinction between this sort of modern self-service business intelligence and data visualization and traditional business intelligence, right? And so I think this is important to acknowledge, especially if you're about to engage in any type of reporting business intelligence data visualization project. It's important that you realize that all of the traditional business intelligence efforts will still remain a large part of that effort, right? And so, for example, when we're looking at data visualization, reporting, business intelligence, typically provide answers to the business, right, so that they can make quick decisions on the state of the business and decisions on how to run the business, etc. And so, in order to do this, oftentimes what we need to do is we need to pull data from multiple sources and aggregate that data, surface it, summarize it, aggregate it in such a way that people can very quickly look at the visualizations and make business decisions. Now, a large part of this effort has always been finding the data and then going through this process of ETL, or extract, transform, load, and loading our data into a pre-aggregated form so that it can be reported on and then surfaced up through SharePoint or whatever, for that matter, any reporting infrastructure. And so this I would submit that for many business intelligence projects and data visualization projects, this will be a large part of your effort. This effort of finding the entities in the different line of business systems, and then within those entities finding the attributes. So we talked about, just a quick recap, because I don't know when the connection was lost, but just quickly we identified the difference between traditional business intelligence and data visualization, and then we looked at some of the components just in blocks, that we would be talking about during the presentation. And then we looked at just discussed the Business Insights template. We acknowledged that this is an enterprise site template that can be used for creating dashboards, deploying reports, etc. And it's pre-configured with all the artifacts that we need to do that. And then I gave a description of the built-in web parts that are included with the enterprise version of SharePoint, and just acknowledge that for some people, this is enough for their business intelligence efforts, that they can very quickly assemble dashboards pointing at data in spreadsheets and then surface that data. So that's where we left off of, at least that's when I noticed that there was the problem. So we start with PerformancePoint Services next. So PerformancePoint Services is there's two components to it. There's a server-side component, and then there's a dashboard designer that allows us to create dashboards and scorecards. The idea here is that PerformancePoint expects these tabular or multidimensional data sets with clearly defined dimensions and measures, and when we have these defined, it allows us to fairly easily create these dashboards and reports. And the way this works is that we use the dashboard designer to create these reports, if you will. You can almost think of them as like little applets or web parts in themselves, but a report can be, a spreadsheet, a SQL Server report. It can be a, link to surface data through a pivot type view of a dimensional cube. And essentially what we do is we create these reports, and then we can drag them onto this dashboard screen, and then we publish that to SharePoint. The key takeaway here is to remember that it expects this multidimensional data with, very clearly defined measures and dimensions. While this isn't a requirement, you'll find that you'll be fighting the technology if this isn't in place. So PowerView was another one of the features that we listed earlier on in the presentation, and essentially PowerView allows us to create presentation views of our data. And so the way that this works is that we create tabular data models, and then we make connections available to those tabular data models, and once those connections are available in the data connection library, then our users can create power views of this data. And again, you can think of it as presentation ready views of the data. And now remember, in the beginning of the presentation here, we're going over highlighting some of these features, and then we'll go into some of them in greater detail as we go along. So PowerPivot for SharePoint, essentially it's two server-side components. It provides query processing and the ability to publish workbooks to SharePoint. Works in conjunction with Excel services as well. And what's really nice with this version, you'll find most of these slides are based on SQL Server 2012. And so I'm going to highlight some of the nice new things that we get when we upgrade to SQL 2012. And by the way, that's available. Some of these features, like for example, PowerPivot and the new service application names with the configuration tool is available regardless of whether you're using SharePoint 2010 or 2013. But the idea is that in the past, PowerPivot's always been a little bit of a challenge to install, configure, etc. But there's a really nice new configuration tool that makes this much easier that's included with SQL Server 2012. So that brings us to SQL Server Integration Services. This is, I think this is probably one of my favorite components of the data visualization stack and working with business intelligence and SharePoint. And the reason for this is it's a very very proven solid technology that allows me to perform ETL. So remember in the beginning of the presentation I discussed traditional business intelligence and how we go through this effort of defining where the data is in the organization, and then we use ETL, extract, transform, load, to go out to these line of business systems and then pull that data into some sort of reporting database, if you will, or staging database, and then we aggregate the data and then we can surface it up to dashboards and reports. And so if you're using the Microsoft stack, SQL Server, SharePoint, reporting services, etc., ETL, extract, transform, load, is accomplished through SQL Server integration services. So if you're working with data in SharePoint, if you're charged with creating a report infrastructure or creating a business intelligence project, and you're not familiar with SQL Server integration services, very familiar with it, then that's something that you need to do. Again, it is the tool that allows for ETL, and so again, extract, transform, load of data within the Microsoft stack. And so the idea is that we use Visual Studio 2013 or Visual Studio 2012 or Visual Studio 2010 to create what are called integration packages. And these integration packages define a source data source that we're going to pull data from, and then within the integration package we can transform the data. So we can combine or concatenate fields as we're pulling from the source data. We can convert date formats. We can essentially just do anything that we want to do with our data. We can do with integration services, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, if you look at the new integration services in Visual Studio 2012, the options and the flexibility and the features that are available for transforming and scrubbing data are certainly plentiful. And then, so once we pull it from the source data system, then we transform it, and then what we do is the L of which is the load part, and so that's where we send it to a destination database, right? So what this might look like in a real-world situation is, oftentimes people will have data, HR data in PeopleSoft, right? We may want to bring that over so that we can report on it in SharePoint, etc. And so what that would look like is we would set up a data source. We would use the OLADB provider for Oracle. We would connect to PeopleSoft. We would consume a view or a table. Oftentimes we're going to consume a view, not an entire table. So the Oracle team will set up a view of the HR data that we need for reporting. We'll configure our Oracle OLADB driver to connect to the Oracle server, pull that view, and then what we can do in our integration package, for example, SharePoint likes UTC dates, Oracle may have a different date format, so what we can do is we can actually convert and transform that date as we're pulling it over to our reporting database. Now, be clear, our reporting database in this scenario is not our SharePoint databases, right? So we would have a staging database or a reporting database of some sort in SQL Server that we would use to pull this data over to. This may be a warehouse as well, right? I mean, we may be designing a star type schema where we have a star schema database, and we're going to pull data from PeopleSoft, pull data from other sources, and populate the star schema, and use that for our reporting database. It could be just a simple relational database in SQL Server, relational with tables, and we're populating these tables so that they can be used for reporting or surfacing it back up through SharePoint. And so you'll find through my presentation here, when I talk about data visualization and business intelligence, this is the preferred method for me, for many reasons. I'm not a huge proponent of using BCS to connect to line of business systems like Oracle and order systems and inventory systems. While I think BCS is a very powerful tool when it's used in the right place within the SharePoint environment, and certainly as a time saver, again, I personally don't use the tool to go off to these systems, these Oracles and these inventory systems, etc. And there's several reasons for that. And let me explain myself a little bit here. If we keep running with the PeopleSoft example, if I were to go into a meeting with the DBAs of the PeopleSoft databases and explain to them that I want to use something like business connectivity services in SharePoint to pull data so that I can surface it up to SharePoint, there's a very good chance that many of those DBAs might not even know what SharePoint is, let alone know what BCS is. And if they really did know what BCS was, they would probably have a problem with me using it to connect to the Oracle system and returning large data sets, through surfacing through the SharePoint site. But if I go into that same meeting and I tell those same folks, hey, I would like to create an integration package and do some ETL to load a reporting database so I can report on it in SharePoint, that they'll understand. They understand this language. I'm sure they already know what SQL Server Integration Services is. They're comfortable with this stuff. Again, it's proven technology. And then the other thing to keep in mind here is that, if we keep, again, working with the PeopleSoft example, let's say you're a large company. By any standards, if you have 50,000 employees, I would say you're a large company, right? So if we're looking at HR data in PeopleSoft, if you have 50,000 employees, that means that you'll be returning 50,000 rows in your view from PeopleSoft. And what I would submit to you is that, using today's technology, SQL Server Integration Services and the fast network and the bandwidth that we have on our internal networks, it will literally take me, most likely less than a second to consume that view, those 50,000 rows from PeopleSoft. And of course, I'm making an assumption that you don't have, numerous amounts of columns, but a reasonable data set of HR data, 50,000 rows, can very quickly be consumed and sent across the network to our SQL server. So I have many scenarios where I have SQL Server integration jobs running every hour, and what they're doing is they're pulling these data sets from places like PeopleSoft, and then they're putting it into SQL Server databases. Oftentimes, it's the same SQL Server cluster that I'm using for my SharePoint farm, and so those databases are stored on the same SQL Server. And what's really nice is once I start pulling this data from my line of business systems and aggregating it into a reporting database or a staging database, now things get a lot easier for me, right? Now when I'm working within SharePoint, if it's not even just reports, but if I want to use a drop-down list in a form, for example, or consume some data through a workflow, it's much, much easier for me now because I can point to the SQL Server and consume the SQL Server data set, and I don't have to worry about this line of business integration. So one key thing to mention here is that as powerful as this is, remember not to forget about security, right? So if I'm going to take a data set of HR data from PeopleSoft and move it into my SQL Server for a reporting database and a staging database, then I want to make sure that I'm implementing the same security on that reporting, that staging database that I have in the PeopleSoft system. So as we start to make these copies, if you will, of our enterprise data and putting it into a reporting database or a staging database, again, we want to make sure that the security is implemented in the same way. Also keep in mind that these are read-only data sets, right? What I'm talking about here is designing a very robust, performant reporting and dashboarding infrastructure. So we don't write back to these data sets, right? We use SQL Server Integration Services and we perform ETL, extract, transform, load to pull from our line of business systems, populate our staging database, our reporting database, which may even be a star schema database, or multiple, which I'll show you actually, which is what I do. And then we use that reporting database, staging database, as a data set for our dashboards and our reports. And this is where things can get. And once we do that, then what we can do is we can start to take advantage of the SQL Server capabilities, things like views and stored procedures, to do a lot of aggregating and pre-aggregating of our data. And surprise, surprise, this is nothing new, right? We've been doing this for at least 2 decades now. It's just standard reporting and business intelligence. And the lesson to be learned here is just because we're doing it in SharePoint now doesn't mean that we don't have to still take care of the basics, right? Which is creating a reporting infrastructure and doing as much pre-aggregating on the SQL Server as we can. And again, I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. So let's talk about reporting services a little bit. Reporting services was greatly enhanced in SQL Server 2012. The integration with SharePoint is much more seamless. So reporting services, it's an enterprise report authoring environment. The key thing to note is that we can create reports using Visual Studio and Report Designer, and that includes any version of Visual Studio from 2008 all the way to 2013, which hasn't quite been released yet, but is available for testing. It's implemented as a service application in 2012. Almost all of SQL reporting services is administered through SharePoint now. It's administered at the farm level, and it's administered at the site collection level. We still have reporting services web parts that we can put on a page and then display a report. And then also note that we have SQL Server data tools that have been released, starting with Visual Studio 2010. And so the way that this works with Visual Studio 2010 and Visual Studio 2012 is that once you install Visual Studio, you install the SQL Server data tools, and you will have new project types to create business intelligence projects. And when you select the mode for business intelligence projects, you'll be able to create SQL Server integration projects for data transformations, extract ETL. You'll be able to create report projects, SQL Server database projects, etc. And so it's essentially a set of templates and tools that allow you to work with the business intelligence infrastructure and within SQL Server. And so this is really nice because in the past we've always had to have multiple versions of Visual Studio installed. It was required that we have Visual Studio 2008 for BIDS, Business Intelligence Design, and then Visual Studio, whatever version we were using for our other development efforts. So this is no longer the case. Reporting services, PowerView, all this stuff gets installed using the SQL Server media. So even as you add, if you install Visual Studio 2012 and then add the SQL Server data tools, you'll notice that even though you've downloaded something called SQL Server data tools for Visual Studio, it actually is the SQL Server installation media, and it's just behind the scenes. It's automatically selecting the feature for SQL Server data tools and walking you through the installation. But it actually comes off the same media, it's the same bits as SQL Server. What's interesting is once you install reporting services and you open up Enterprise Manager or SQL Manager, you no longer connect to the local server to look at the settings for reporting services. It may be difficult to see on my screen here, but under server name, I actually have the URL of a site collection here. And when I click Connect, what happens is in the Object Explorer, it opens up this view where I can see jobs, securities, roles, and look at the roles. What's happening is actually you're viewing the SharePoint groups in this particular site collection that has the reporting services features enabled. And so my point in showing you this screenshot is that there's very little configuration that we do with SQL Manager. Almost all of the administration of reports happens either through central administration or at the site collection where we enable the features for reporting services. And once we enable those features for reporting services, then we can go down to the content type, for example, the report, and we can drop down the context menu and manage the report. We can manage schedules, permissions, etc., etc. So again, in 2012, it's a service application. What's also interesting is SQL Server Reporting Services has two different designers that are available to us. So we have the Visual Studio IDE, which can be used to create reports, but there's also a lightweight browser-capable report designer. It's called the Report Builder. What's nice about the Report Builder and the Visual Studio IDE output is that they both create RDL files. So RDL is report definition language, and as we create a report in Visual Studio and persist or save that report, it's saved as a .rdl file. And this is true whether we create the report in Visual Studio or Report Builder. And what's really great is we can actually round trip between applications. So imagine, if you will, DBA report writer creates a report, spends time in Visual Studio IDE, creates a dashboard or a report, and then publishes it to SharePoint, and then you have somebody more of an analyst role or IT person / analyst that then in the report library opens the report in Report Builder, makes changes, and those changes are reflected immediately in the report that's being displayed to the users, and it's also being displayed the next time the developer opens up the report in Visual Studio, so we can, again, round trip these reports. It's all RDL underneath the scenes. The way that this works within Report Builder is that we essentially, what we're doing in Report Designer is we create these reports. We create a report project, we add reports, and then when we deploy, it takes those reports and it deploys them to a report library in SharePoint. And it also deploys the data connections as well. I find SQL Server Reporting Services to probably be the most powerful tool in the suite of data visualization features, if you will. And the reason why is because this has been around forever. It's very mature. You know, it's at least 10 years old, the reporting infrastructure. And I know that at the end of the day, I can build any dashboard that I need within Visual Studio and the Report Builder. You know, as I'm working with things like PerformancePoint and PowerView and PowerPivot, they're all great at doing something. But at the end of the day, there's always limitations, and I find using these tools to create a complete dashboard. But if I use SQL Server Reporting Services, I can combine different elements of those features. I have all of the power of Visual Studio at my disposal, and again, at the end of the day, I find I can always create the dashboards I'm looking for in SQL Reporting Services and Visual Studio. So it's one of my favorite features. You know, if you've been a DBA for a while, or working with business intelligence for a while, or building reports for a while, then you should appreciate what I'm telling you, right? If we pay attention to this traditional business intelligence stuff that hasn't changed in 20 years, where we basically go out, we get data from other systems, we put it into a staging database, and use that to report, and then combine that with the fact that we have Visual Studio to develop these dashboards and then publish them to SharePoint. I'm hoping that this is making some people feel very comfortable in, and that a lot of this really is not new stuff. The only thing that's really a little bit new are just some of these visualization components. And speaking of that, this slide addresses PowerView, right? So PowerView, the reason why this slide is here with the reporting stuff is because PowerView with SQL Server 2012 is actually installed with reporting services. And so when people see that, they think, well, is this supposed to replace the report builder? And so to be clear, that's not the case at all. PowerView is a very simple tool that allows you to very quickly consume tabular data sets and then very quickly create presentation-ready views of your data. And so the reason why this is because it's very data type aware, if you will, and it makes a lot of assumptions about how you want to handle your underlying data types. And the idea is that this would be a tool that, again, more of an analyst, IT/analyst person would use to create data visualizations. Oftentimes what gets overlooked when you're looking at these demonstrations of PowerView is the work that goes on behind the scenes to get this PowerView to work, right? So, while the UI for creating the actual PowerView is very simple to use and somebody at an analyst level might be able to put it together, what you need to remember is that there's this big effort behind the scenes of finding the data that needs to be reported on, ETL, getting the data into a tabular data structure of some sort so that it can be consumed through PowerView. Once that's done, then somebody needs to go into a data connection library and create a semantic data connection back to that tabular data structure. Once that data connection is in place, then yes, then from that point forward, people can consume that data set using PowerView and very quickly create these presentation views of your data. If you ever need to remind yourself what the strength or the benefit of PowerView is, just go ahead and click on the File menu, and you'll see one of the only options there is Export to PowerPoint, right? So again, think of it as the sort of PowerPoint for your data is the way that I like to think of PowerView. Quickly worth noting, when we moved to SQL Server 2012, the Excel rendering extension changes. So in SQL Server Reporting Services, if you're viewing a report, you can save that report as an Excel spreadsheet. In previous versions, it was saved in the format of 2003. Now it's the standard OpenXML version of Excel. A little bit more about the SQL Server data tools. We add them in after we install Visual Studio, and then we can convert older projects. So if we have older report projects, we can go ahead and convert them over to the new SQL Server data tools project. And so with that, I'm going to switch and go into just a little bit more of a demo mode, especially because we lost a little bit of time with the audio problem. So just bear with me here while I switch screens. Oh. So you're looking at this is a remote server that I'm running, and I want to use this server to go ahead and just demonstrate a couple of the things that I was talking about. First of all, I'm going to spend just one more minute talking about the importance of the SQL Server integration services and putting together our reporting infrastructure, if you will. So you're looking at SQL Server Management Studio now, and I'm going to go ahead and connect to integration services on this computer. And you can see that integration services actually shows up as another node underneath the database engine. And so what will happen is that as somebody that's putting this together, what you're going to do is you're going to end up using Visual Studio to create integration service projects. And when you build those projects, they turn into packages. And then once you have the package, then what you're going to do is you're going to go into SQL Server and you're going to import the package. Once that package is imported, it will show up under this MSDB folder, and then you can use SQL Server, the SQL Server agent, to schedule this job, schedule a job to trigger the ETL package as often as needed. So you know, it may be in any environment where you're putting this stuff together, you may have several or one to many integration packages on different schedules, and essentially what's happening is SQL Server agent, as the schedule comes up, it's going to go out, trigger job A, get the data, trigger job B. So again, this would be a job to get data from PeopleSoft, a job to get data from a clinical system, etc., whatever your line of business system is. And this is more of a discussion around data visualization, SharePoint and SQL Server, not so much integration services, but it's such a key part. I wanted to make sure I paid attention to it, but I'm not going to walk through a demo of creating a package and deploying it to SQL Server. But do your homework. Again, I mean, if this is stuff you're going to be working with, you should be aware of integration services and how it can be used. Now, one of the things that I like to do, so in this scenario here, and by the way, this is a demo environment. So one of the things, I'm a partner in a healthcare software company. We built software that hospitals are using to run the administration side of the hospitals, and this is actually our demo environment. And so it's nice because you're looking at a very real-world situation, but using demo data to view some of these features, if you will. So if I look at our reporting or staging database, if you will, for this particular application is called Activity. And if you look at an activity, I have several standard relational database tables in here. And what happens is when those jobs run and they pull data from the different systems, it's populating several of these tables in here with with that data. But then what's worth noticing is we have many stored procedures that we use to actually pre-aggregate the data and load the data into these tables, right? So for example, if I want to create reports based on FTE allocation and salary data. Okay, again, sorry about the interruption. Looks like there was another hiccup there. I think I identified it very quickly, though, so I don't think anybody missed out on much of the conversation. Again, I was talking about the importance of pre-aggregating our data. So we populate our tables here. We pre-aggregate using stored procedures. And then notice here also that we have lots of views that we use. So as we're creating our dashboards and reports in SharePoint, we're not consuming data directly from our tables in SQL Server. We're consuming data from various different views. And what's important about that is that the views allow me to further pre-aggregate and filter data. Again, we want to do as little of this as possible using visualization tools. So we want to do as little sorting, filtering, and aggregation as possible when we're using Report Builder in Visual Studio, PowerView, PowerPivot, all those tools. Again, we want to try to keep as much of that as possible here at the database level. Now, one more thing I want to show you here while we're in SQL Server. When I bring this data in, I create a reporting database, a relational database called Activity that's used for our application as well as reporting. But I also create a tabular data structure as well as a multi-dimensional data structure, right? And so I'm pretty sure we have this in this demo environment here, but if I connect to analysis services, what you should see is a cube version of this relational data, if you will, and also a tabular data structure. And what that allows me to do, so you can see here, here's the tabular version of the same data. So what's nice is, you know, again, just think about the scenario. Every morning, let's say at certain different times, I'm pulling data from different parts of the enterprise, right, into my SQL Server, into my relational database, and then I'm pre-aggregating that data as much as I can. And then I have jobs that kick off and create a tabular data structure as well as a cube structure. And so now what happens is my users, my report writers, regardless of whether they choose to use PowerView, PowerPivot, you know, the report builder, they have the appropriate data set to connect to. Okay, and so what I mean by that is if you're using PerformancePoint Dashboard Builder, for example, you don't want to connect to a relational data set. You're going to fight the technology the entire time. You need to connect to a tabular or even a multidimensional set with measures and dimensions. But if I make sure I have all three data sets in my SQL Server, then I'm enabling my users, I'm truly enabling self-service BI, right? I'm truly enabling them to pick the tool that they want to use to report on the data set. And so that's worth noting. So now let's get out of SQL Server and we'll just jump into Visual Studio real quick. I'm actually on this server, I'm actually using the Visual Studio 2010, not 12. You know, everything that you see is in 2012, it just gets better. So just, and this works for the purpose of our demonstration here, so just bear with me here. So I'm actually loading a project, a reporting project. Again, this is in Visual Studio 2010, and what you'll see is that in here I have a solution. The solution has a report project, and then in the report project I have several, I think I have like 25 reports in here. And this is please note this project infrastructure. Many times I see people creating reports in Visual Studio and they're creating one report per project. You know, note it's just like any other project in Visual Studio. We have a solution, a project, and then we can have many artifacts underneath the project. Notice that I have a data source here. The data sources allow me to connect. In this case, I've got one data source for analysis services and one for the relational database. And then I have my reports. What happens is I design my reports, and then when I click deploy, what will happen is that these reports will be deployed to the server that you see here. So in this case, they're going to be deployed to demo.realactivity.com, and then the site, I believe, is called Insights, Data Connections, and then the data source folder is identified. So you set this up once at the beginning of your development effort with the report builder, and then once it's set up, you click on Build and Deploy, and what will happen is all of these artifacts will be deployed to the SharePoint server. So if we look at, so now I'm looking at a Business Intelligence Center in SharePoint. If I go ahead and click on Activity Insights and then go to Additional Reports, you'll see that all the reports have been deployed here. And if I were to show you the data connection library, the data connection has been deployed to the data connection library as well. And so notice in this particular server, I'm actually going through the process of migrating this server to 2013 now. And I have a couple of 2013 servers that were already running the same software on. Just due to time, I don't want to flip over those servers. But what I can tell you is that none of this really changes in 2013. This process of deploying the reports, deploying PowerView, deploying PowerPivot, all of this stuff is pretty much the exact same as it was in 2010. There are some great enhancements from a IDE standpoint using Visual Studio 2012, right? So as I upgrade my Visual Studio version, that's where I really see the most benefits in terms of what I can do with reports and the business intelligence stuff. So just quickly, what I'm going to do is just demo a couple more things and then start to wrap things up here because we're going significantly over time here. But we talked about some other technologies as well, things like PowerPivot, PowerView. And so if we take a minute to look at PowerPivot, the key things that you need to know here is that, again, it's a server infrastructure. It needs to be configured. It configures multidimensional sets of data, consumes multidimensional sets of data. And the way that this works is that we download the PowerPivot add-in for Excel, and once we do that, we're going to have a new tab called Power Table or PowerPivot Tools, if you will. And when we click on that group in the ribbon, we have the ability to create a new sheet, and then we can drop the data into the sheet based on our connection. Actually, the first thing you do is you connect to the data set. That's what this is, change data source. And then once you connect to the data source, you can select the entity that you want and add it to the spreadsheet. And then you can do things like filtering, etc., filtering of the data set. And so all of this work is actually done within the Excel client itself. And then what we end up doing is we can save this as is up to a document library in SharePoint, or we can actually publish it using Excel services so that we only expose this worksheet to be available through the site. So the idea here is that again, we create the PowerPivot view in the Excel client, and then we publish it to a library using Excel services, or we just copy up the entire worksheet, up to SharePoint. Keep in mind that there's an entire server infrastructure for caching of data and connection pooling that allows for this PowerPivot stuff to work. The idea here is that because of the application tier that PowerPivot introduces, we can consume many, many rows of data, massive amounts of data, and very quickly pivot, sort, and filter that data. And again, it's because of what the users don't see behind the scenes. We're basically laying down an infrastructure of servers to handle the caching and connection pooling of that data and then surfacing it back up to the users. So that's a little bit more on PowerPivot. Once the PowerPivot stuff is published, then you can go ahead and you publish it to a PowerPivot gallery, PowerPivot library, and then you can go ahead and open it up through the browser, and you'll see that it will render much like it did in Excel. This may take just a quick second here. I'm running on a single server, and I haven't opened up the spreadsheet in a while. So here we go. So this is that same spreadsheet. Notice now it's just being rendered through the browser, standard Excel service stuff here. So now another thing I'd like to just show you quickly is, remember we talked about PowerView as well. So if we go back here and try to find, sorry, bear with me here 1 second. Okay, so here I have a PowerView that I created. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and select Edit in PowerView. And what you'll see is it's going to pull up a Silverlight application, client application that will allow me to create the PowerView. Remember, PowerView allows us to very quickly create presentation-ready views of our data. It's much like PowerPoint for data. And the other interesting thing that you should note here is I demoed reporting services for you. I demoed PowerPivot for you. Now I'm demoing PowerView. And notice that I'm viewing the same data, right? So what I mean by that is in this PowerView, I'm looking at that data in the activity tabular data structure, right? So this is and the PowerView is split up into multiple views, but it's viewing the same data set as reporting services, but a tabular view. When I was using Visual Studio and reporting services, I was consuming the activity, the same data set, but I was using the relational data set version. In PerformancePoint, I would use the cube version. So because I've taken the time to do this ETL and create 3 different types of data structures, if you will, one multidimensional, one tabular, and one relational, I've empowered my users to pick the tool of their choice, and they'll be able to create these different visualizations based on, on the, more or less on the same data set. Notice, so PowerView, back to PowerView, what happens is we connect to a data set. Once we do that, we see the entity over here, and then the attributes. Again, entities are tables, attributes are fields. I can go ahead and drag them onto the canvas. I've created 3 different views here. The first view is a card type view of the data, and then some scattered data charts, and then finally a raw data dump of the data. And then what I do is I go ahead and I publish this back to the site, and then it can be launched and viewed directly in the browser. So this would represent an end user or somebody actually pulling up the data set, the PowerView in the browser as we're getting going in the meeting. And so here you can see I can flip through the views, right? So here's my scattered data view. Again, think of this as PowerPoint for data, if you will. And I can go into full screen mode. You see that here. And so the PowerView. So PowerPivot, PowerView, PerformancePoint Services, Excel services. We have the built-in web parts, the Insight Center. Remember that we also have third-party web parts that are available to build dashboards. I think the takeaway here, the key takeaway though, is remember SQL Server integration services. Remember extract, transform, load. Remember that the traditional business intelligence techniques that we've learned and used for many years don't change, right? We still have to identify the entities and attributes in the organization that we need to answer the business questions. Once we do that, we need to use extract, transform, load, and if you're using the Microsoft stack, that means SQL Server integration services. We need to use ETL to pull data from those sources, the entities and attributes, and then pre-aggregate that data into different forms: relational database, cube form, and tabular form. And then remember that we need to do as much pre-aggregation on the server as possible. So all of our calculations, filtering, and sorts should happen at the SQL Server level. And then once we have that in place, all the rest of this gets easy. Then it's very easy to use Report Builder to create reports based on this data structure. Then it becomes very easy to use these Power Views and Power Pivots. And what you're going to find is if you put that effort in at the lower tier, the database tier, you're going to find that your reports are very performant, very fast, very robust, and the complaints where people are complaining about rendering time or comparing, why are my business object reports faster than my SQL Server reports, all that stuff will go away. But what you need to do is you need to pay attention at the lower level, at the SQL Server level, the ETL level, and then the rest will take care of itself. The other nice thing is, now you can start using BCS, right? So now that I have that data in a reporting, in a relational database, that's at the point where I love using BCS. Now okay, I'll create an external list, I'll display the employees, but I'm pointing it at my local SQL, I say local, but my SharePoint instance that's local to my, my SharePoint farm, and I have control over the data set, and I'm not connecting to a live system, right? I mean, one of the first things we learn in computer science when it comes to reporting and consuming data is we don't connect to live systems when we're crunching numbers and reporting, right? We build staging and reporting databases. And so in my mind, BCS is really a visualization tool, right? I mean, on the underlying infrastructure, sure, there's some complex stuff there, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's just aggregating and surfacing data to SharePoint. So I look at it as no different than any other reporting type tool, if you will, conceptually, right? And so, and maybe that will help understand why I prefer to use this BCS infrastructure report against, local data sets, if you will, not live line of business systems. So with that said, thank you for your time today. It's been it's always a pleasure to talk about this business intelligence and data visualization tools. And I think what I'd like to do now is I'll turn the webinar back over and see if there's any questions that I can answer. And again, thank you very much for taking time to listen.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation today. There's a saying, Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And certainly that was the case today, but you recovered very well. It was a brilliant presentation, and we've been flooded with comments praising you. So thanks very much, Paul. And a big thanks as well to everyone who has stayed on the line for the entirety of the webinar. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to ask you a few questions now, Paul. One question is, can you give an example of how predictive analytics could be done using visualization offered by SharePoint 2013?
Yeah, I think I would rather answer the question this way, not necessarily give an example, but I think when you're looking at these things like predictive analytics or big data or data mining, all of the concepts remain the same in that we need to understand that this is an effort that happens outside of SharePoint, right? So, predictive analysis implies that you're going to have a lot of CPU horsepower, crawling a lot of data and trying to do some sort of forecasting of the data and whatnot. And so that's going to happen outside of SharePoint, and you need to make sure that your data sets that support that are in are in place, and that you're doing as much of the pre-aggregation as possible before you surface it up to SharePoint. And then once you have that and you want to go ahead and surface it up, then there's lots of different ways that you can surface it. Most likely using something like SQL reporting services, and examples. Typically, that predictive analysis is used a lot in forecasting. So I guess if I had to give one example, it may be where you're looking at large amounts of employment and FTE type data, and then also crunching it with other data, perhaps clinical data, and you're trying to forecast position control, for example, in large institutions, large hospitals, large institutions. We do a lot of work in healthcare, so I'm most familiar with this type of stuff within the context of healthcare.
Okay, perfect. We have another question here. Is Report Designer part of Visual Studio or a separate product?
So there's two report designers, if you will. So I can design reports in Visual Studio. I actually open up Visual Studio and create a new project, and I select a new report project, and then I'm using, I call it the report builder in Visual Studio, but I guess, technically you're using the Visual Studio IDE to create these reports. Now, so that's the Visual Studio side. There's another tool, client-side tool, called the Report Builder. It's actually called Report Builder, I think, and that's a click once application that you initiate it by going to a report library and selecting a report and dropping down the context menu, and you select Edit in Report Builder. And that's not part of Visual Studio. It's a click once application that gets installed with the reporting services and gets tied to the report content type. And then as users select to edit the report in the Report Builder, again, it's a click once application. It downloads to their client, their workstation, and installs as a client application, and then they use it to to design or change reports. So there's two different, it's a trick question almost, right? Because yes, there is a report builder that's part of Visual Studio, but there's also the report builder that's a click once application that's not part of Visual Studio. And they both render RDL files. That's a nice thing about these tools is regardless of which one I use to create my tool, when I save it, it will be persisted as a .rdl file, and both tools will understand how to open that up, and you won't have any problems using both tools to edit the same report.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. Another question here. In PowerPivot or PerformancePoint, Is it possible to use its full potential and data exploration in a non-multidimensional data set?
Well, especially not with PerformancePoint. There are some tricks. You'll hear some people talk about how you can create an Excel spreadsheet that points to a cube or some other type of data set, and then you can consume that spreadsheet in PerformancePoint. But the reality is that PerformancePoint is a tool that is designed to work with multidimensional data sets. If you create a multidimensional data set with clearly defined measures and dimensions, you can very quickly create dashboards in PerformancePoint. If you try to fight against this, this idea of having a multidimensional data set, it will be very challenging. You're going to be trying to find ways to work around things the entire time, and it's a struggle. So, I would strongly suggest that if you're going to use PerformancePoint, especially, that you have a multidimensional data set. PowerPivot, the same way, right? For that matter, if you don't have a multidimensional data set, other than the fact that you can display huge amounts of rows in Excel, why would you, why use PowerPivot? Why not just dump it to a spreadsheet? I would think so.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. We're running a bit over time, so that's all the time we have today for questions. We will make the webinar recording available next week, slightly more edited version, and we'll make the slides available too, and all attendees will get an email. So I won't take any more of your time today. Thanks again to Paul, and thank you to all attendees for coming today. Goodbye.